Welcome everybody to this masterclass brought to you by Country Navigator, saying no to power. My name's Andy Bruff. I'm talking to you today from South Africa, and it's a real pleasure to have you all on board. I see we have people from as far afield as China, France, Turkey, the Netherlands, India, Denmark, Serbia, Germany, the US, Amsterdam. Just fantastic to have you all with us as we talk over the next hour about this fascinating topic of saying no to power. And of course, we're not saying that power is the thing we've got to say no to. We all need to have power in our lives, but it's about pushing back when you are dealing with somebody who may be in a position of authority that you don't have. So let's begin by just thinking about, why do we find saying no to people in authority so difficult? And to do that, I'm going to ask you to consider what some of those reasons are. Give me your feedback in chat as to what makes it difficult to push back when you're given a request that maybe you are not able to fulfill, or you're unwilling to meet, or you're in a position where you just cannot do what you're being asked. What makes it difficult? Go ahead and give me your thoughts in chat if you can, and then we'll move into really understanding something of the dynamics at play here. I know that for me, setting boundaries is just critical. Sometimes you have multiple priorities on your plate. You know that there's that urgent and important crisis intervention that needs to be addressed. And by juggling so many priorities, you can end up in a situation where you actually achieve very, very little. So I think what's important is to recognize that it sometimes is difficult because you have a strategic client, you're afraid of repercussions, there's the pressure to perform, there's the whole question of social class. It feels like I should be able to do this no matter what. And if I reject, then they may consider me as lazy or incompetent. It may damage the relationship. And I think many of us have been in that situation where we've responded purely out of obligation. I know I've been in that situation many, many times. Well, what I'd like to ask you to do is to join us in a virtual whiteboard experience, which we call Mural, where you have an opportunity to click on this link. And it's going to give you just that simple chance to click on what we call a sticky note. You can enter as a visitor. Luke, that particular link, I think, is not working. So we're going to just need to refresh that. So you enter as a visitor. And what I'd like you to tell me is, have you been in a work situation when you've said yes, but actually you wanted to say no? Give me an example of where that's happened. And what did that situation look like? What was the result? What was the outcome? What was the challenge? Just to confirm, you click on the sticky note and you can just drop in a few bullet points there, and we'll take that information immediately. Luke is also sharing the screen, so we can see that we've got a number of you in the room already. Just hover over that sticky note and you can jot down a couple of things for us. A work situation where you said yes, but you really wanted to, or probably should have said no in hindsight. So I can see some of you are typing already, which is great. And we'll give you a few moments just to think about that. I think the reality is, as you are typing, that we've all been there, right? Your manager asks you to take on a project. You're already stretched beyond capacity. They flatter you by saying how good you are. You ask yourself, goodness me, how on earth can I say no without appearing, as some of you have already said, uncommitted or disengaged? You might have that client that's got the unrealistic expectations. And you know that to be able to deliver within budget, you're going to have to push back. But again, as some of you have said, what does that mean for the relationship? So as we look now at what some of you got in the sticky notes, a couple of you are talking about accepting a new task, even though you were completely exhausted. So you didn't have the physical resources. Somebody else says handling something directly instead of delegating. I think that's often a big challenge, particularly for those of us who are individual contributors. I'm not perceived as a team player. I'm in a situation where I accepted a project, but I was really not overwhelmed by that particular project. It was a boring task. The opportunity sounded too good to say no. Taking over old tasks from my job, or taking tasks from my old job, just because the new person was not as engaged. I think these are all very, very powerful examples of some of the things that happen to us when we're in a situation where we probably should have said no, but we ended up saying yes. So Victor, just to answer the question on the sticky note, just double click on the sticky note. It should then give you the text option within that as you double click on that. Let me know if you're stuck. But we're not going to spend too much time on this. We've got a lot more that we want to cover. I think the bottom line is that saying no in the workplace or in any context can be challenging, particularly if you're dealing with somebody who's in authority, somebody who's in a, quote, more powerful dynamic than you are. And these scenarios that you're giving us here in the whiteboard, we've seen time and time again as we've worked with leaders around issues of negotiation, issues of power, issues of influencing without authority. And I think how we react may well depend on how we relate to that authority, how comfortable we feel with verbalizing disagreement. And this can often come down to cultural preferences. And so what I'd like to do is just give you one more minute to type in your answers into the mural, and then we'll move on and show you a framework that we use in Country Navigator that gives you an opportunity to understand how the cultural dimensions of these factors could play out when we say no to power. So let me just have a look again. Somebody was already overloaded. They wish they hadn't taken on another task. I said yes to a colleague, even though I didn't agree with her. She was my manager. I was worried about the repercussions of being misjudged by saying no. I was simply being asked by a senior person in question and was relating to the project. And I would automatically assume that it was my responsibility. Somebody else talks about misplaced motivation. So thank you for your case studies. These are incredibly powerful. You may still be typing on that, but Luke, we're going to click out of that and go straight into the next slide. And what I want you to see here is that there is definitely an opportunity to consider how power may work in this whole process from a cultural dimension. Now, at Country Navigator, we use a tool called the World Prism. It measures 9 dimensions of culture. We're not going to talk about all of them today, but I do want to talk about 3 of them and how they impact on the context of saying no. So the first one is this notion of the dimension of whether you are more explicit or implicit as a communicator. By the way, if you're interested in the Country Navigator Prism, we can certainly sign you up and give you an access and a test run in terms of the profile and all that it offers. But one of the things it does is it gives you a profile on 9 dimensions. It's not a psychometric tool, but it will give you some insight as to where you are at any point on these polarities. If you're more to the left, you're more explicit. You mean what you say. You're direct. There is very little context to your communication. However, if you're more implicit, it's very much around meaning being inferred. You're not necessarily going to need all of the context. And as I've worked with highly implicit leaders around the world, they will tell me that in many cases, they're able to leave things unsaid. And yet there is somehow a tacit understanding with the other party. So that's going to impact on how you work in terms of saying no. If your communication style is more implicit, you might prefer to take different routes to say no while avoiding the no completely. If you're more explicit, you might in fact be somebody who is telling it like it is and expecting the same in return. Your no is clear, it's concise, even when you are in a situation where you're needing to say no to people in power. So that would be the first thing, is where do you sit on the continuum of explicit, implicit? The second thing to think about is the dimension of really understanding where you are in terms of power decision-making. Are you somebody who prefers to have a relationship with power that is distributed, shared, as we call it here on the left-hand side? How much respect do you give or deference to people who have seniority? How regulated is your workplace? If you're more in a consensus-based, participative kind of culture, then you would be looking to work more towards the left. However, as you work with many cultures around the world, you will see that there is that innate hierarchy, that tendency to want to escalate issues to a higher level of authority where the concentration of power is more limited in the hands of a few. And if you view power and authority as concentrated, then saying an explicit no might be completely unacceptable. It's a sign of disrespect, and it could harm your face or the other person's face and the relationship. We know that face saving is a very important priority in many cultures. But of course, if you are more on the left-hand side of this one, and if you have a more share-orientated style, then it's quite likely that you will be happier to say no. You'll be in a situation where you might use different elements of being told no and valuing that people give you that clear answer. You believe that everyone is responsible for their workload, and for that reason, you'll be much more direct with saying no and with disagreeing. And then the third and very important leg in this whole thing is the notion of whether you are in a more individualistic culture or a group culture. I think what's important here is to understand that there's often a quite strong I in disagreeing and say no. That would be more individualistic. And for those individually orientated cultures, that's a comfortable position. These are individuals who focused on their achievements, on their goals, and they believe that everyone individually should be held accountable for their actions and for their performance. But for a group-oriented culture, we comes before I. And what you have then is a situation where saying no is going to be detrimental to group harmony. And it could be perceived that you are letting the side down if you were to say no. So I would want you to think about where you are, either left or right or somewhere in the middle. We're often asked, Andy, what does a good profile look like? And of course, there is no such thing. There's just different. But definitely there will be implications for how you respond to saying no to power, depending on where you are on these three dimensions. Now, before we get into more detail on the saying of no and really thinking about the impact of that on cultural styles, let's understand what happens when we don't say no and how to decide when the right time is to say no. So to do that, I'm going to share a case study with you. And I'm hoping if you could just give me a thumbs up or a yes in chat that you're seeing that. Go ahead and read this particular case study. I won't give you too long. And when you are ready, I have some questions for you. So once you've had a chance to read through the presentation, the case study, just give me a ready in chat. And I have some questions which I'm going to ask you to comment on. Okay, thank you, Juliana. That's great. We'll give the others another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll move into our discussion. All right, thank you. Okay, so I have two questions for you. I've put them into chat, and I would ask you to give me your thoughts there. So first of all, what's happening here? And I'm focusing particularly on Noah. And the second point that I want you to think about is what would be the impact on Noah or on Anna or on anybody else in terms of his inability to push back? Give me your thoughts once you've had a chance to work through those two questions, and we can debrief the answers together. I hope that you can see the questions in chat, and that's the medium that we'll use to get your feedback as well. Thanks, Anke. So there's this idea that eventually Noah could burn out. Vilo talks about this idea that Noah is afraid, possibly, of being considered as a simple mortal. Laura talks about the fact that Noah is not being heard. He's reinforcing this pattern by accepting work that he can't handle, and this will probably lead to burnout, as already Anke, we heard from Anke, and failure. Tim talks about a health risk. Juliana talks about a question when Noah doesn't, or a statement when Noah doesn't say no, he's also implicitly telling Anna it's okay to keep asking for impossible tasks. And there's that word boundaries, which is so important. And Anik talks about this notion that nobody asks Noah how he's doing. So I think you've certainly got a really good insight. Thank you, Vilo. Risks on his mental and physical health and relationships. So there's a double-edged sword here. Noah is highly diligent, clearly very talented, overwhelmed, is not pushing back. He's becoming increasingly stressed. And eventually we see this impacting on the quality of his work. Thank you, Raya and Daniel and Chris. We've got some powerful words here. People talking about fear of losing, Noah having a fear of losing his job. Good people being asked to do more. Noah being abused via unreasonable requests. A behavior and inability to say no, perpetuating Anna's behavior, this reinforcing cycle. And Olivia talking about the fact that Noah will need to accept, with some conditions, delay on the project, and maybe even finding more people to work with him. So thank you so much for that. Now, I think the other thing that's really important is when we look at this scenario, we see that his inability to push back impacts very much on a number of areas. And if we go to the next part of this, you will see that as time moves on, he becomes increasingly stressed. He has to sacrifice his personal time. He's working late into the night and even on the weekends. And as you all predicted, this is now affecting his work-life balance, his well-being, his performance, the quality of his work. He did try to say no, but implicitly this wasn't enough for Anna to understand that he simply couldn't do it. I wonder if you've ever been in a similar situation and possibly would be prepared to share that in chat with the group. If there's anything else you want to add to what we've put down here. But it's interesting how even before I showed you the impact in part 2 of this scenario, most of you had already anticipated that this was not going to work out well for Noah. Have any of you been in a similar situation? Maybe not you personally, but you know of colleagues who have found it difficult to say no. Thanks, Anis. So periods of grind that are not sustainable. There are a number of you saying, yes, you've been there. It's a tough call to put those boundaries in place and to be willing to push back, particularly when you are dealing with questions around your career, your job security, and needing to feel that you are a team player. At this point, what I want us to do is begin to consider the whole notion of how this would work out for us in terms of the impact. And we know that the research that is around not saying no in the workplace is very, very clear. It's this notion of your well-being, your relationships, the impact on job satisfaction, the impact on performance and productivity, and ultimately on the business itself. Can you think of any more that should be on this list? Can you think of anything else that we should add as to why we should say no when we need to? Okay, I'm not seeing anything else come through, but if you want to add something, absolutely, Chris. It's all about the importance of respect as well. And I think that's great. And of course, culture. So team, as we've got to this point, let's now segue into talking about the way to say no and a framework to help us to do that. The first thing that I want you to think about are the consequences. So if I say no to this request, what is the impact? What is the impact on me? What is the impact on the person asking and making the request? What is the impact on the business? Secondly, if I am going to say no, how do I do it in a way that is absolutely clear and unambiguous? One of the things I learned early on as I began to study the world of negotiation is it can be incredibly powerful to give reasons before your disagreement. Often we are inclined to say no because, and typically what happens is people do not hear what comes after the word no. So it may be important to substantiate why you're saying no first before you give that no. And then the last thing that's important is the judgment around timing. Choosing when to say no is absolutely critical. Well, to help us with this, let me ask Luke just to stop sharing there. And then what I'm going to do is line up a video for us, which gives you some insight into the power of no and why that is so important. So let me get that ready for you. Just give me 1 second.
As it is to say yes.
Are you hearing that, Luke?
It is coming through. Looks good.
In a psychologically safe workplace, saying no is not questioned. In theory, it should be just as easy to say no as it is to say yes when you're asked to do something. Of course, we know that in practice, things are just not that simple. We are conditioned to say yes. And if we're in a concentrated power or relationship-oriented culture, saying no has a price tag. It threatens harmony. It can be seen as a challenge to authority or a sign of weakness. Saying no is particularly difficult for people under the influence of imposter syndrome, who are often the most marginalized employees. Saying no shows that you value yourself and your own well-being. It shows that you have a clear sense of your own capabilities and can relieve stress and build confidence, but only if you're able to do it effectively. Saying yes can get you in trouble. You take on too much work and either miss deadlines or submit substandard work. In the long term, you're more likely to burn out and leave a job you used to enjoy. It's damaging to your health, your motivation, and your reputation. I want to suggest some ways to help you say no that will build your confidence and reputation, preserve your well-being, and help you give your best. Often we're worried about saying no, particularly under pressure. If you're nervous or lacking the confidence to say no immediately, ask for a little time. Can I get back to you in 30 minutes? Again, don't explain why you need the time, but keep it simple. Giving yourself a breathing space allows you to respond more effectively and confidently. Firstly, analyze the real consequences of saying no. What really is the worst that could happen? If you say no to your boss, they might say, well, actually, I wasn't asking you, I was telling you. You haven't lost anything at all. If you're asked to try and save someone's life, the consequences are a bit more important. And then you really have to be and have a very good reason indeed. We're rarely in such an extreme situation, but if you have considered what might happen if you say no, you're better equipped to actually do it if you need to. And don't forget that non-work personal reasons can be just as valid as the work ones. Secondly, be clear that you are saying no. Avoid a conditional no or probably not. Be definitive. Polite, yes. Sensitive, definitely. But say, no, I can't do that. Push back carefully. I have other priorities at the moment. I don't think I can do that. I can't make that work. I don't think you need to provide a detailed explanation, particularly if the person asking you knows you and has worked with you before. Sometimes it can be helpful to add a small detail. I have a high priority task to finish first, or I don't have a free evening at the moment. And finally, choose your battles. Make sure you are saying no to things that you really cannot do. Whatever the reason, be clear on your values so that when you say no, you're on solid ground. Be consistent to your internal drivers and demonstrate that you have the self-awareness to set and keep to your own boundaries. Don't be afraid to stretch your limits, but do it on your own terms. Saying no at the right time to the right things is good for you and for the organization you work for. And if you say no, it serves as an example to others and reinforces your culture of psychological safety and inclusion.
So there's the learning summary: saying no to power, analyzing the possible consequences of a no, being clear that you're saying no, and very importantly, choosing your battles. Let me stop sharing that. Luke, handing it back to you as we now think about really getting your input on what we've just spoken about. How do you decide if it's the right time to say no? Give me your thoughts in chat. So we've seen some really insightful approach to how to do this, but how do you know when it's the right time? Please share your thoughts in chat with us now. So Victor, thank you. That whole notion of choosing the right time based on work-life balance, I think is important. But let's try and be even more specific. How do you know that you need to be saying no? Irina, the overloading part, I think, is important, critical. Let's see what others have got. This is not about being difficult. This is not about just being somebody who's always thinking in the opposite. But recognizing that when I'm in a situation where I have too many requests, Olivier, when the priorities are clearly communicated, one is able to say no to less important ones. Thank you, Daniel. Nikki, when I know that I won't be able to give 100%. Raya, when I feel I push myself to the limits. These are all really insightful comments on when it may well be a good decision to say no rather than yes. Keep those coming as we move into the bottom of the hour. So from there, let's now think about a judgment checklist. I think what's really important is, as we build on all of the feedback that you've given me there in chat, here are a couple of others that you might want to consider. The first is, when I get this request, does it actually correspond to my usual responsibilities? Is this out of the ordinary? Is this over and above? And we know that there may be times when that happens. And you may need to make the choice whether you are prepared or able or willing at that moment to go above and beyond. And that may involve asking questions around whether this offers you an opportunity to learn a new skill, to be part of a new experience. And it may be a trade-off between saying this is going to put some more load on me, but the opportunity is going to be worth it. And that comes to the second checklist point, which is, does that request align with you and with your individual objectives or with the team's objectives? If it does, it's going to be much easier to say yes. If it doesn't, that may just be another early warning indicator that this could be something that is outside of, to coin an expression, outside of your wheelhouse. The third thing is, practically, do you have time? And not just do you have time, but do you have time to do a good job, an excellent job, without sacrificing existing commitments? Does the opportunity that you've identified earlier on leave room for that personal life that we heard earlier, where people were talking about work-life balance? And I think very importantly, do you actually have the skills, the know-how, and the qualifications to fill this need? Now, let's really acknowledge that there are many times where you and I have taken on things knowing that we don't have what it takes, but we want the experience, we want the opportunity, we want the job. So I think that last one has got to be seen in reason, but very often we overstretch, we over-aim, knowing that we don't have what it takes, and then we find ourselves wheel spinning because we don't have the time or the resources or the expertise, and it just creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what I'd like to ask you is, as you think about this process, is this something that's going to complement what you're already doing, or is it a detour? If this is a new request, how does it fit into your objectives? Is it worth taking on, even if it could be a potential distraction? You might have some other suggestions that you want to put into chat in terms of this judgment checklist. And if you do, feel free to add those into the chat now, before we move into looking at some of the psychology of how to say no. Just having a look in chat here, people are pushing back when they feel that they are already at the limit, when they don't have the skills, when they realize they may need to work another 60-hour week, when somebody's shifting responsibility. Vilo talks about this notion of self-reflection, this notion, Laura, that the last time I took on a challenge and stretched myself, did it really yield the results that I wanted? And Daniel talking about this question of, does someone else in the team possibly have the capacity and the capability to take it on? And I think, Daniel, that's a hard question for people who are high achievers, individual contributors, and who struggle with delegation. It's such a critical question, but as I work with leaders around the world, I think that does require some very significant self-reflection. So in the remaining 25 minutes, let's segue into another discussion. And this discussion is moving beyond just when to say it, but now thinking about how do we do that. And the first thing that I want you to see is a fantastic framework that I came across many, many years ago that tries to give us some insight into the difference between passive communication and aggressive communication on the extreme left and right of this scale. And somewhere in the middle is this notion of establishing the balance through assertiveness. So let's start on the left. If you are a passive communicator, then you will be naturally disposed to want to prioritize the needs, the wants, and the feelings of others, even at your own expense. You will violate your own rights and values. You will often be in a situation where you will not respect your needs and your desires. You don't have the boundaries in relation to other people. And your primary goal, your operating system, if you like, is to please others and to avoid conflict. Why? Because your identity is tied to your relationships. And so the communication of this passive behavior is often, don't take me into account. You're more important than me. My feelings don't matter. And if you think about the impact of that, again, we've already looked at it. People are anxious because life often seems out of control. They feel stuck. They feel that they're ignoring their own feelings. They feel so tied to the need to be accepted and validated by others that they're unable to really address real issues. And you see it in the language of a passive communicator. They will say things like, I'm unable to stand up for my own rights. I don't know what my rights are. I tend to get stepped on by everybody else. I feel weak. I feel disempowered. I feel unable to take care of myself. People never consider my feelings. And so as the antithesis to that, what you then see are leaders who move into a different identity operating system. And there you see the traditional command and control leader whose focus very much is on an identity that says, I am my results. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to elevate my needs and my wants and my feelings over and above everybody else's. I'm sure you've worked with or worked alongside or maybe even reported to a leader who does this, a leader who uses humiliation to control, a leader who criticizes, blames, attacks, is impulsive, has a very low tolerance for frustration, speaks in loud, demanding, and overbearing language, and acts often threateningly and even rudely. So this aggressive communication is one that elevates the needs of the individual above the needs of everybody else. And I think what we're trying to establish here is something that we call assertive communication. And I'm going to ask you in a moment to tell me how you feel about that word. But by assertive communication, we're really trying to illustrate that there is a balance between your needs as the person possibly on the right-hand side and the needs of others represented by the blue circle on the left-hand side. An assertive communicator is somebody who stands up for their own needs, their own wants, their own feelings, their own priorities, but is also very, very committed to listening and understanding and respecting the needs of others. So let me ask you this question. How do you feel about this word assertive as we talk about it today? What are your thoughts? What word pictures come to mind? Do you have positive, neutral, negative connotations? Give me a sense of how that lands with you as we talk about maintaining balance and saying no to power. So thanks, Victor. Okay, Anissa is saying she doesn't see it visually so much as a balance. Some of you are saying negative, some of you are saying positive. Yeah, and I think that certainly does track with many of the responses that we get. And Juliana makes the point that in definition, it's great, but it's certainly subjective in terms of its interpretation. I think the point is this, that it's about self-care. It's about fundamentally looking after what is important for us in terms of good mental health and healthy relationships. But at the same time, it's also about ensuring that you are showing empathy and understanding of the needs of others. And Nikki makes a great point, that often it's a very short road to being aggressive. And what's important to understand is that the aggressive communication is really something where the needs have shifted. And once again, you have elevated your needs above those of others. I think the one we haven't spoken about, which is really often less obvious and more subtle, but highly manipulative, is something called passive-aggressive communication. So this is a style where individuals are very polite, very affirming on the surface, but underneath that surface, they're acting out in a subtle, indirect, or behind-the-scenes way. They develop this passive-aggressive communication often because they feel powerless, they feel stuck, they feel resentful, and they feel incapable of dealing with the object of their resentments. And so instead, they express their anger by just subtly undermining whoever it is that they're talking to in terms of their resentment. So I think it is important to understand that. Eva makes a good point that we need to also understand, where does assertiveness become completely egotistic? And I think that's something that we have to look out for. So having looked at that, let me ask you to consider that there may in fact be another kind of communication, a fourth style of communication, if you like. And this fourth style of communication is something that we're going to talk about in more detail, having looked at the passive-aggressive. Let's also suggest here's a situation which could be any one of these. So here's the situation. Your manager asks you to stay late while everyone else leaves. You're always the one who stays late. And tonight you have plans. What I want to find out from you is, how do you feel about the response? So let's have a look. Give me your thoughts. You can just put a P or an AGG or an assertive into chat. Give me your thoughts. And of course, if you just say A, then remember it could be aggressive or assertive. So let's go for A for assertive and AGG for aggressive. Not a chance. I'm done with staying late. Find somebody else. Okay, so that's the first one. Let's look at the next one. How's this for a response? Okay, I think I can stay. Let me know if there's anything else I can help with. Again, passive, aggressive, or assertive. Okay, looks like many of you have got that one. The majority of you are saying passive. By the way, I would agree with those of you on the first one who said it's aggressive. Let's look at some other examples. Here's number 3. And here we're looking at a response that says, staying late doesn't suit me. I have plans. What are your thoughts? Of course, we don't know what tone of voice this is delivered in, but if we look purely at the vocab, what are your thoughts? Passive, aggressive, assertive? Some of you are saying aggressive, and I can understand why. I think if it's delivered in the right tone, it could be seen as more assertive. And part of that is because there's a validation in there, and there's an acknowledgement of your own needs, but also recognizing possibly the urgency of this. Let's go for 2 more very, very quickly. We could spend a lot more time on these. I understand that there's a lot of work that needs to be done urgently, but I have plans for this evening. I'll be happy to help tomorrow during my office hours. Again, passive, aggressive, assertive. What you're seeing is there's an increased level of sophistication with this one. There's an acknowledgement of the need of the other party. There is a clear statement of the plans and priorities of the individual giving the no, but there's also an alternative solution. I'm not just backing out, I'm not just shutting down, I'm not just giving you a zero option. And I think we could argue that that is probably more assertive. Again, I can understand, Daniel, why you might see it as passive aggressive if it's delivered in a way that is sarcastic or undermining. And then the last one that we have here is, I've noticed that I always stay late when everyone else leaves. What can we do to stop this from happening again? Let's have a look. And just to pick up on Hans's comment there, that it's great that we see the nuances between the responses. And I think, humans are complex, context matters, and of course, non-verbal communication, body language and tone is always going to be important too. Nikki makes an interesting point about the during office hours piece of number 4 and suggests that that could be perceived as passive aggressive. And here we've got somebody talking about what can we do to stop this from happening again. That could also be, depending on how it's delivered, possibly viewed as moving from one to the other, from assertive to maybe even passive aggressive. I think the point is not for us to necessarily agree on all of the classifications, but simply to show that even in a simple scenario like this, there are multiple options for when and how to respond, and to think about which of these are going to build the relationship and which of these are going to harm the relationship. I think what's important is that the aggression is certainly not going to build the relationship, and the passive isn't either. And if we continue being passive and accepting work and requests that are above our capabilities or against our values, then we're going to be on a clear road to eventually feeling resentment and possibly being in a place where we're just unhappy at work. I think the assertive communication, when it comes through correctly, builds relationship because it protects our needs, but it does also take into account the needs of the other party. And it sounds different in different cultures. You might recognize, even on that third statement, that that might be perfectly acceptable in a very explicit culture, but in a more implicit culture, that even might be seen as too direct. So understanding the cultural context of this is really important. And that's why you might say, well, surely there are some, model answers here, Andy. And whilst we might suggest what we see as passive or aggressive or passive aggressive, the cultural context matters as far as these various contexts are concerned. Let's move now to think about some alternatives. So we know that no is direct, no is pretty drastic in some cases. And I wonder if you've got any alternatives. So rather than just saying no, I shared one example with you at the beginning about giving reasons before disagreeing. You heard the presenter on the video say that in some cases that's not even necessary. But what are your alternatives? Maybe you can give us some examples in chat as to what the other options are to say no without saying no. So we've got a yes, but, and Daniel, I think, again, depending on context, that can be productive or counterproductive. Anis talks about saying yes and then going on to ask what others I need to deprioritize. So there's a trade-off there, there's a concession making. That may be helpful. What else? As you're thinking about that, I'm glad you thought about me, but the alternatives, Juliana mentions that somebody else might be able to do the job. I think for those of you who are part of more implicit group-oriented cultures and with a more concentrated orientation of power, saying an explicit no is definitely regarded as both aggressive and offensive. So even if you find that you're saying and hearing the word no is acceptable, you've got to make sure that you can adapt your no to avoid offending, to avoid harming someone's face that we spoke about earlier, to avoid sounding aggressive, and of course, to preserve the relationship. So what I'd love you to think about is how that might work and how you might do that in a short scenario. So thank you, Laura, for your example there. That's brilliant. Let's go into another mural whiteboard activity where we have an opportunity now to really share some examples of alternatives. So we're going to stop sharing the screen. We're going to go back into another link, back to the whiteboard, the sticky notes, and let's think about how we could come up with some possible alternatives. And Luke will share his screen at the same time. Okay, so here's the scenario. Your line manager has just asked you to join a new project that will take a lot of time and effort to complete it. If you were to accept, your other projects will suffer, so you decide not to. How do you say no? We don't have too much time. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I realize you're on the clock here, but go ahead and give me your thoughts in in the sticky notes on the mural. Double click should give you an opportunity to type. And even if you can't write full sentences, just give us some bullet points in this whole thing. Victor, I know it flies when we're having fun, right? Victor says in chat, wow, time flies. Okay, some of you are getting it right. Hover over the sticky note, double click on it. Again, your line manager has just asked you to join a new project that will take a significant amount of time and effort to complete. And if you were to accept, your other projects would suffer. So you decide not to. How do you say no? Hover over the sticky note. Thank you, Luke, for enlarging that for us. Double click on it, and you should be able to type almost immediately. We've got enough sticky notes there, I think, without people needing to add new ones. You should be able to get onto the sticky note and then double click it and start typing. I can see I've got 2, 4, 6 of you, 7 of you that's working well for. So that's great. So thank you for all your inputs. Of course, what we'll do is we'll make a record of this mural. We'll keep it. And I'm sure, Luke, we can send it out to all the participants at the end. Would that be possible?
We'll have them say it for us and I'll keep it in our recap.
Fantastic. So I'm not going to read all of them. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. I will pick up on a couple. Somebody says, out of respect for the success of the project, I have to decline. There's that balance of the other party's needs and my needs. I would not be able to complete that new project in the needed quality. So there's the reasons for disagreeing as well. And you do not see the word no there, which is incredibly powerful. Somebody else says, I cannot give it my 100%, which it deserves. Thank you for considering me, but that will not be according to my strengths. At the moment, I don't have the capacity to join this new project. I need to down prioritize the other project. Is that what you can accept? So what I love about this is you're starting to craft these responses where you are pushing back. You're doing it politely, you're doing it firmly, you're doing it assertively, but you've also come up with some incredibly powerful examples that I'm certainly going to be using without necessarily saying no. So saying no without saying no is incredibly powerful. I'm dealing with other priorities. I cannot give this my full attention, and I'm sure somebody else could do a better job than me. Well, you may well still be writing up your thoughts there. You've got a couple of minutes to do that, but I think we're going to come out of that screen, Luke, if we can, and go to the very end of the presentation as we just start thinking about summarizing some of the things that we are talking about today. So here we go. Here's our key learning steps for what we've spoken about on this program. I think the first is that saying no, or not saying no, should I say, is clearly a situation that over time can harm your well-being, can harm relationships, can harm your work, can harm your organization. And I would add, can harm your credibility. But so does the wrong no. So understanding your cultural style, not just your own cultural style, but the context of the people you're working with. Are they more implicit? Are you somebody who's pretty direct and outspoken? And how will that very direct no or indirect no land with the audience that you're talking about? We saw from the video that it's important to analyze the consequences of saying no. And then when we make that decision to come across with that very clear no, to do it in an unequivocal way, but also to choose our battles. We're not going to be saying no to everything, because then there is argument dilution and people don't take us seriously. I remember years ago, one of my mentors saying to me, no needs to be used like fine spice. It needs to be used carefully to add flavor. But if you just use it all the time, then it starts to lose its power. That means being assertive. It means valuing other people's needs and your own as well. And I think what's really important is learning how to practice saying no, when to say no, and understanding that in some cases, as we saw from the last brilliant mural exercise, that might involve saying no without saying no. So let me close by suggesting to all of you that if you have any inquiries about Country Navigator, about the World Prism, please go ahead and make a note of the email that I will ask Luke to put into chat now, support@countrynavigator.com. We'd love to chat to you about how you could use this tool to not only understand something about your own culture, but what happens with national cultures around the world, and also how you can avoid the pitfalls of falling into stereotypes, but recognizing that there are tendencies. We have really brilliant data on more than 200 countries. You'd be joining up with over 1 million users on the Country Navigator platform who are now using this tool to learn about themselves, to invite others in to do team comparisons, and are using this information in a variety of contexts to help with decision-making, to help with team building, and, as we've said today, to help with saying no to power. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop those into chat, or you can send them to the email support@countrynavigator.com. But with that, for the final time today, let me thank you for joining us on this masterclass, Saying No to Power. I wish you well. Bye-bye.